How Ireland Received the Gospel and Paid Back Its Debt. It was written by Paul E. Kretzmann and published around 1915. Look at that heading again. It may seem strange to you, but this section of our stories is usually interesting with many lessons for us. Ireland really did receive the gospel of Christ in a most remarkable manner, and the debt which the country thereby took upon itself was paid back in so wonderful a way that we shall speak about it not only in this story but in the next as well. We all know, of course, where Ireland is situated. It is the Green Island, west of Great Britain and Scotland, whose shores are swept by the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, and whose climate is very much milder than the corresponding countries in the same latitude in America and in the interior of Europe and Asia. It is an interesting country in so many ways, also in its scenery, in its history, and in its many traditions. Many of us, whose forefathers did not come from a beautiful Erin, have worn a green ribbon or flower of that color on March 17th. In doing so, we were possibly not altogether clear as to the meaning of this custom. It was done because others did it and because it seemed a jolly thing to join them in their observance of the day. Few people know that March 17th, set aside in memory of Patrick of Ireland, is a day which connects Ireland not only with Scotland and England, but with the entire western part of the continent as well. That is the story which we shall hear now. Let us remember, first of all, that the gospel was brought to England at a fairly early date. It has been said that there are evidences connecting Joseph of Arimathea with work in England, the place where he is said to have had his first church being Glastonbury. But whether this is true or not, we have ample evidence showing that a large part of England had been gained for Christ by the beginning of the 4th century, so that bishops from that country were present at a synod held on the continent at that time. Besides, one of the earliest Christian churches was built at Silchester in England. It is one of the great tragedies of the Christian church that the early Christian churches of this country, established for 2 centuries or more, were scattered far and wide with the invaders from across the sea, the Angles and Saxons, in the middle of the 5th century, and carried death and destruction over all the country. But long before this terrible event came to pass, the Lord arranged to have the gospel brought across the sea to Ireland. Just when the people of Erin first came in touch with the British Church is hard to say, but there must have been some few Christians there at the beginning of the 4th century, since at that time, about 431, a missionary by the name of Palladius came to the island to minister to the few Irish believers in Christ. This man landed at Wicklow and tried to gather the scattered believers, but he labored in Ireland for only a short time, dying in Fordun in Kincardineshire on his way back to Rome. This was about 431 A.D. The number of Christians at that time seems to have been very small indeed, and they were confined to the southeast coast. But the Lord of the church had meanwhile arranged for another man to bring the gospel to the beautiful Ireland, a man whom he himself prepared in the most remarkable way for the work which he was to do. This man was Succat, or Patricus, now known very generally as St. Patrick, the bishop and apostle of Ireland. He came from a Christian family. His grandfather had been a priest in the old British Church, and his father a deacon. He was born at a place called Benavim Tabernae, which is now known as Bonavin, near the present Kilpatrick, between Glasgow and Dumbarton, in the southern part of Scotland. He grew up in the midst of Christian influences, but does not seem to have been particularly conscious of unusual abilities until after he had gone through some strange experiences. When young Succat was 16 years old, he was captured and carried off to Ireland by pirates who sold him as a slave to a chieftain by the name of Milko. This man was the owner of extensive meadowlands in County Antrim, and the boy was self-employed as a shepherd and cowboy. It was a hard life, but one which was filled with, nevertheless, with blessings, for Patrick himself later wrote concerning these 6 years. He said, "I was reformed by the Lord, and he hath fitted me for being at this day what was once far enough from me, that I should concern myself or take trouble for the salvation of others, when I used not to think even of my own. The impressions which he gained at this time were invaluable to him in his later life. He compared the beautiful Christian lives that his people led at home with the godless lives, of the people among whom he was forced to labor as a slave. After 6 long years, Patrick managed to escape and to return home. After a second but short captivity, the impressions which he had gained in Ireland were riveted still more deeply upon his mind, and gradually the resolve formed itself within him that he ought to make some effort in behalf of the heathen of Ireland. During the next period of his life, Patrick, as he himself relates, had various dreams or visions, possibly on account of his continual thinking about the needs of Ireland. At one time he saw a man who carried many letters, one for him being headed by the line, "Words of the Irish People," and he went over to the continent, where he received systematic instruction in the monasteries of Martin of Tours and Germanus of Auxerre, some of the early missionaries in northern France. It seems that when he again returned to his home in Scotland, that he had received another dream or vision in which he heard the voices of men who lived near the place where he had been a slave, crying out to him, "We beseech thee, child of God, come and again walk among us." It was then that he definitely decided to become a missionary among the Irish people. So Patrick left his land, this time entirely by his own will, and sailed for Ireland, landing at Wicklow. He sought out his former master and gave him money to pay for the loss which his escape had caused. He also appealed to the aged chieftain to accept the gospel of Jesus and to become a follower of Christ, but the Irish nobleman was too proud to listen to his former slave. When Patrick was driven away from the place, he sailed north and entered Strangford Hallow in County Down. It was there that he gathered his first congregation in a barn, the ruins of which, known as Sabhal Padharig, the barn of Patrick, may still be seen. But the difficulties were by no means all overcome at this time. The message of salvation took hold but slowly on the Irish pagans, who were largely addicted to the idolatry in various forms. Among other things, the natives had a form of fire worship, and one of the ceremonies of their spring festival, held about the 3rd week of March, was one connected with the return of the sun. Now Patrick and his first son in faith, later his successor, a man by the name of Benignus, were slowly extending their field of influence. On Easter Eve of a certain year, they had come to the neighborhood of Tara, the capital of the great chieftain by the name of Deogair. This was the center of the ancient fire worship of Ireland known as Druidism. On that particular evening, no one was permitted to kindle a fire until the chieftain had lighted a blaze upon the royal hill as one of the ceremonies of the spring festival. Patrick and his band, unaware of such a law, lighted their fire to prepare their evening meal. Hardly had they done so when they were surrounded by the Irish fire worshippers, who savagely demanded their death. Things looked bad indeed, but Patrick did not for a moment lose control of the situation, while the Druids prepared to bring him and his band before the heathen chieftain. He mused and prayed and wrote down his thoughts in a beautiful poem. And the closing passage of this hymn, as it had been preserved in the writings of Patrick, read as follows. May Christ, I pray, protect me today against poison and fire, against drowning and wounding, that so in his grace abounding I may earn the preacher's hire. Christ as light illumine and guide me. Christ as shield overshadow and cover me. Christ be under me, Christ be over me. Christ be beside me, on the left hand and the right. Christ be before me and behind me, about me. Christ this day be within and without me. Christ the lowly and meek, Christ the all-powerful, be in the heart of each to whom I speak, in the mouth of each who speaks to me, in all who draw me near, or see me, or hear me. At Tara today, in this awful hour, I call upon the Holy Trinity. Glory to him who reigneth in power, the God of the elements, Father and Son, a paraclete Spirit, which three are the one, the everlasting divinity. Salvation dwells with the Lord, with Christ, the omnipotent Word, from generation to generation. Grant us, O Lord, thy grace and salvation. And after this preparation for the ordeal, Patrick calmly faced the chieftain whose anger had been unknowingly aroused. He carefully explained that he had no desire to disobey the custom of the country, but that he was engaged in a work which was greater than everything on earth. His wise and peaceful attitudes so impressed the chieftain that he was invited to preach before the entire royal assembly. It was in this way that Patrick won the people to listen to him. He preached from the Scriptures the Christ of salvation, with a persuasive power peculiarly his own. He won over one heart after the other, of noble and peasant, thus gradually moving whole tribes of Celts, whom he then further instructed and built up in the faith, training the most promising of them as missionaries to other tribes and for work across the sea. It was not long before all through Ireland Patrick became famous for his pleasing manners and kind words. Men with noble ambitions and high purposes began to seek him, desiring to know him and to live with him and become like him. The number of these men was so great he could not attend to their instruction alone, but was obliged to organize schools and colleges. The fame of these schools spread not only through Scotland and England, but also to the continent. In his preaching, his tongue was the vernacular of Irish. He gave the women her proper place in the family life. He insisted upon schools also for the boys and girls, where the alphabet which he invented was taught to them. He did the work of the true evangelist, completing his evangelization of the island not by introducing the means of civilization, but by emphasizing the glorious facts of the gospel, whereby he won men to give up idolatry in all its forms and to cling to the redemption wrought by Jesus. His conversion of Ulster was especially notable, for there he established his northern center. Around the church which had then been built, and the house in which he died, there grew up the city of Armagh, the church capital of Ireland for many centuries. It is interesting to note in this connection that the ancient Irish church was tribal and monastic in its organization, without an episcopal form of clergy or government. Patrick's grandfather had been a married priest. There is no auricular confession, no adoration of Mary, no extreme unction in the reliable accounts of his life. Amid the savagery of the times, married missionaries gathered together in brotherhoods, and unmarried women and widows in sisterhoods. The women's societies, of which that of Bridget of Kildare, the Cell of the Oak, became the most famous, consisted of women who were under the vow of chastity and celibacy while in the sisterhood, and who with prayer and meditation, like the deaconess of old, gave their lives to home and inner mission work. The most striking feature in the writings of Patrick is the frequent reference to the quotation of Scripture, for which he used the translation made by the great theologian of Bethlehem, Jerome. It was the fact of his making the Bible the basis of all his teaching that also shows in the work of his pupils. For from Ireland, men went only to Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, carrying the spark of Patrick. Even in Iceland, there have been found relics and records of the presence of these Irish heroes, showing that neither distance nor difficulty could keep them back in their desire to win men for Christ. The very first instance of the repayment of the debt which Ireland owed to Scotland for sending Patrick was the gift of Columbia, the missionary hero trained by the Irish schools, who brought the gospel to northern Scotland. The name of this apostle of Scotland was really Kretzmann or Columbusale, and he was of royal lineage, one of the many youths of noble birth whom Patrick, Beneganus, and their successors attracted to the career of a missionary as the greatest calling of all. He was born in 521 at Gartan in the Donegal Hills, and was educated in the monastic communities founded by the Apostle of Israel. He was early distinguished for his piety and deep interest in the work of the church, and laid the foundations of several monastic communities while he was yet a young man. Thus it is told of him that after he had been ordained to the ministry, he cut down the oaks on the shore of Loch Foyle, and there built the monastery which grew into the city of Londonderry. And after this he founded other schools for the training of young men, so that his prophet schools were favorably mentioned by the Venerable Bede, the great English historian. But Columbia was not yet satisfied with the work which he had done for the Lord. Training of missionaries for the foreign field was one thing, but he felt that being a missionary himself was greater. When he was 42 years old, therefore, he crossed the Irish Channel to Argyllshire, Scotland, and with 12 companions founded on the little island of Hii a settlement which became one of the foremost missionary schools in history. It is interesting to note that he made the trip to Hii, or Aya, called also by its adjective, Iowa, which a misprint of Columbia's biographer changed into the words of Ionia, in a hide-bound wicker workboat. The settlement which he had planned was begun and can still be traced in spite of the fact that Benedictine buildings of the 13th century now stood partly restored and stand on the sites of Columbia's wooden abbey and daub cell. The kindness of Columbia's character is apparent from his entire work. When, for example, his uncle Ernan, who was at the head of a branch of settlement on the island of Eubea, felt that his end was near, it was more his last desire to meet Columbia once more. And the younger man, having set out from his cell to welcome his uncle, felt the power of death when he saw Ernan fall to the ground shortly after he had landed and expire not far from the shore. So deeply was Columbia moved by this incident that he gave a description of the scene in a beautiful poem, which shows the warmth of his loving heart and the depth of his piety. It was on Hii, or Ionia, that Columbia spent the last 34 years of his life, and a part of the time he was in the field himself, and it is hard to say how many of the savage Picts or Dalriadics Scots were gained by his impressive preaching of Christ crucified. But he also spent many months and years in directing the work of his assistants. We may well picture him as he sat and wrote and read, while an attendant, and occasionally one or two of the brethren, stood at the door awaiting his orders, or as he slept on the bare ground with a stone as his pillow, or as he fell down on his knees in prayer for the land and for the people in whose interest he had given up his home Ireland. How thoroughly saturated with scriptural thoughts was all the writing of Columbia may be seen from the few fragments which have been preserved. Thus we have the following nature poem from his pen. And he wrote, "Delightful would it be to me in Uxid Elan, on the pinnacle of a rock, that I might often see the face of the ocean, that I might see its heaving waves over the wide ocean, when they chant music to their Father upon the world's course, that I might see its level sparkling strand. It would be no cause of sorrow, that I might hear the songs of the wonderful birds, source of happiness, that I might hear the thunder of the crowding waves upon the rocks, that I might hear the roar by the side of the church of the surrounding sea, that I might see its noble flocks over the watery ocean, and that I might see the sea monsters, the greatest of all wonders, and that I might see its ebb and flood in their career, that my mystical name might be, I say, back turned to Ireland, that contrition might come upon my heart upon looking at her, that I might bewail my evils all, though it were difficult to compute them, that I might bless the Lord, who conserves all, heaven with its countless bright orders, land, strand, and flood, that I might search the books all that would be good for any soul, at times kneeling to beloved heaven, at times as psalm singing, at times contemplating the King of Heaven, holy chief, at times at workout with compulsion. This would be delightful. At times plucking dualistic from the rocks, at times fishing, at times giving food to the poor, and at times in my solitary cell. The best advice is the presence of God. To me has been vouchsafed. The King, whose servant I am, will not let anything deceive me." In the simplicity of his heart, Columbia here pours forth his thoughts, the calm contemplation of a believing heart, which knows itself to be in harmony with God and with all the world around him. The following description of Columbia is given by his biographer, Adamnan. From his boyhood he had been taught or brought up in Christian training, in the study of wisdom, and by the grace of God had so preserved the integrity of his body and the purity of his soul that, though dwelling on earth, he appeared to live like the saints in heaven. For he was angelic in appearance, graceful in speech, holy in work, with talents of the highest order and consummate prudence. He lived during 34 years an island soldier, and he never could spend the space of even 1 hour without study or prayer or writing or some other holy occupation. So incessantly was he engaged night and day in the unwearied exercise of fasting and watching that the burden of each of these austerities would seem beyond the power of human endurance. And still, in all these, he was beloved by all, for the holy joy ever beaming on his face revealed the joy and gladness with which the Holy Ghost filled his inmost soul. No wonder the effect of his life and work was such as to make the island of Ionia for more than 2 centuries the place in all the world whence the greatest amount of evangelistic influence went forth, and on which, therefore, the blessing from on high rested in great measure. The extent of his work and of that of the men trained in his school is shown by the fact that during his lifetime the gospel was generally accepted by all the tribes of the western Picts of Scotland, by the people of the Hebrides Islands, whose numbers may have been small, but among whom missionary work could be carried on only with the greatest difficulty, and for many people in the Orkney, Shetland, and Faroe Islands. When studying the life of this man, we rejoice particularly over the fact that Columbia was almost entirely pure in doctrine, since he held firmly to the Scriptures and to the denial of the various early errors as they had been refuted by the Church. One of the early writers says that Columbia, that he received naught but the doctrine of the evangelists and apostles. He did not insist upon a church government which placed men in the place of the Lord, but introduced the so-called monastic government whereby the churches learned to govern themselves. No wonder that his influence extended even to England, so that Lindisfarne on Holy Island on the coast of Northumberland became a second Ionia, a center of learning, which gave its name to the Lindisfarne Gospels, a fine version which was used during the Middle Ages. The church was fully established in Northumbria under King Oswald in 635 A.D., thereby bringing about the conversion of the angels in that country. The people fairly flocked to hear the word of God. Possessions and lands were given by the king to build schools, and the younger people of the neighborhood were instructed by their Scotch masters. Columbia worked in this interest of the gospel to the very last. His last work consisted in transcribing the 34th Psalm, stopping with the 11th verse. They who seek the Lord shall want no good thing. When he had gotten this far, he stopped, saying, The next words, Come ye children, hearken to me, belong to my successor rather than to me. He died thus on June 9, 597, much as the great English church historian Beattie died, in the midst of his work of teaching the Bible. His life had been nobly spent in paying back to Scotland the debt which Ireland owed. Patrick, a man from Scotland, had brought the gospel to Ireland. Columbia, an Irishman trained in the schools of Patrick, brought the gospel to the Picts and the northern Scots. So marvelously does the hand of God work in the missions. What an inspiration to us to work in the field while the Lord gives us life and strength.